I got a special tip that the governor was at Weird Al on Friday.
Don't do this.
So basically, he gets a letter from Pam Bondi, and he says, you know what? I got plans tonight. He wanted to be with his people, Scott. White and nerdy.
Oh, my God.
Federal overreach? Eat it.
This is levels of cringe we have not yet reached on this podcast. Like, for me, like Weird Al is like going back to my homeschooled self where I didn't know beat it. I knew eat it. I didn't know the words to
own it.
Yeah.
This is your life, and you be proud of it.
It's this here Anakin guy, not this I don't even know the words.
Bye, Miss American
Bye, Miss
Pie.
American Pie. Yeah. It's time for Sound Politics.
Maybe it's time for Sound Politics. Welcome to Sound Politics, the show about this and the other Washington. I'm Libby Denkmann.
And I'm Scott Greenstone, and this week we're talking about letters, good old-fashioned snail mail.
Yeah, amid all the news out of D.C., the Trump administration deploying the National Guard to the city, meeting with European leaders and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and a promised executive order to end vote by mail. See, there's the tie-in.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
These letters we're going to talk about are escalating tensions in this corner of the country. Trump's Justice Department sent us some letters. We sent letters in response. And we're going to get into how our state leadership is contemplating this moment when Trump is trying to consolidate even more power for the executive. He's disregarding court orders, declaring crises on pretty shaky legal grounds that give him sweeping emergency powers, and just how far this could go.
Yeah, and the crux, I think, of a lot of this is immigration. And we have not talked a lot on this show about how Trump's enforcement ramp up in, immigration has affected people here in Washington. From January to June, there have been nearly 800 federal arrests of people in Washington, which is a 35% increase from the same time last year, according to the Washington State Standard. And even though Trump has said he'll focus on violent criminals for deportation, a lot of these people arrested so far do not have criminal records in this country, outside of the misdemeanor sometimes of, being here undocumented.
Yeah, the vast majority, 2/3 of people arrested did not have criminal records. Yeah.
So in the second half of the show, we'll talk to State Representative Julio Cortez about how these enforcement policies are impacting immigrant communities in our state. But first, the letters.
Yeah, and Scott, you reported on these letters first from Pam Bondi to Washington State and different cities and places around Washington State. So what gives? What happened?
Yeah, so last week, Attorney General Pam Bondi sent two letters, one addressed to Washington's governor, Bob Ferguson, and the other addressed to Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell. And they're just two of over 30 letters to governors and mayors of what she calls sanctuary jurisdictions, places with laws that prevent local law enforcement from cooperating in many cases with federal law enforcement. And the letter, which is kind of boilerplate, I think, it's vague but threatening. So Bondi mentions a potential review of federal law enforcement funds that go to states, or even potentially criminal charges for those, and this is a quote from the letter, using their official position to obstruct federal immigration enforcement efforts.
So, Bondi's letter to the governor, from what I could tell, didn't really get specific about how state officials were allegedly getting in the way of federal immigration enforcement. But Ferguson assumed, and I think it's safe to assume, that Bondi is talking about the Keep Washington Working Act that state lawmakers passed in 2019 during Trump's first term, and that limits cooperation between the state and federal immigration authorities. So police can't ask about citizenship status unless it's related to a local investigation, and they generally are not supposed to give immigration officers access to inmates in a local jail, for example.
And I should note that has actually been contentious in parts of the state, like Adams County Sheriff and Snohomish County prosecutors have recently ended up in court for allegedly doing things like telling federal immigration authorities about undocumented immigrants they've arrested, or holding people in local jails who haven't committed crimes other than, the misdemeanor crime of crossing the border.
So Ferguson gets the letter last week. He holds a big press conference. That was on Tuesday, I think.
That's right.
And how does he respond? Scott, you watched this press conference.
Yeah, so Ferguson really honed in on that one line that I mentioned about criminal charges. He said we're not going to bend the knee to he described the Trump administration as one that day by day drags us closer to authoritarianism. And he shared this one story that I have heard before, but it kind of resonated a little bit differently with me this time. So the story is during Trump's first term, Bob Ferguson is walking his 8-year-old at the time daughter home from school, and she asks him if he could get in trouble for challenging the president. And he told her, there are countries where I'd go to jail for that, but we're lucky. We don't live in a country like that. Here's what he said on Tuesday, though.
The idea that now I need to have that conversation with my daughter, and explain, maybe I'm not so sure about that. Now our country, a U.S. Attorney General threatens her father and other state officials with exactly that, going to jail. For what? For what? So, look, I try to be careful with my words. I really do, but we just really got to be honest with what's going on in our country right now. We really do.
Emotion in his voice there. I also saw that the letter he wrote back to Bondi was pretty fiery.
Yeah.
Did the Attorney General respond at all? Did AG Bondi respond?
No. I emailed a spokesperson for the Justice Department who said, they pointed me to just kind of a wide range of threats she's made in different media. Like on Fox Business, she's talking about these states and cities she sent letters to, saying if they don't comply, we're going to do the same thing Trump is doing right now in D.C., and sending in the National Guard. And she said in a press release she might claw back law enforcement funding, or they'd look at that. She mentioned that in the letter, too. She mentioned a lawsuit. Like we said, she's talking about criminal charges. It's just kind of a scattershot approach. It's like all the threats.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this has been in courts recently. Like the Trump administration sued Illinois and, have tried to claw back funding in California. All of this has kind of been litigated, and oftentimes the Trump administration is losing. Does the Attorney General, does Pam Bondi have the authority to bring criminal charges against Governor Ferguson? Would this be another lever that they could actually try here?
I talked to a UW legal scholar about this, and she said charging Ferguson criminally would be hard. You'd have to prove that Ferguson is actually concealing or harboring immigrants, depending on, what code you're saying he's violated. I mean, charging someone for, enforcing a state law in their official capacity, I don't, that's tough. But this scholar said, and her name is Danielle Evans, she teaches constitutional law at UW Law School. She said, that said, it seems to me that we're in a quasi-authoritarian state where the executive branch can do as it pleases, and the courts aren't serving as much of a check. And you'll remember that they have charged that judge from Milwaukee. So it's not unheard of.
Tipping off somebody who was in her courthouse and trying to escape immigration authorities.
And that's a direct action, right? So that would be easy. That may be hypothetically easier to charge. Ferguson, you'd have to find a direct action that he's made.
Like he was calling people to tip them off about an action or something. So Danielle Evans saying we're in a quasi-authoritarian state. I wonder how much comfort we're supposed to take from that quasi part of that. There are these other things going on. So Trump has tried to cut law enforcement funding for states with laws like Washington's before. I mean, is he going to try that again? Are we going to see the spigot of money for law enforcement cut off here?
She said she would review it. Like you mentioned, the courts have sided with the states that say, hey, look, Congress, appropriated this money, right? You have to spend it. That's in the Constitution. One court did side with Trump during his last term, and the Supreme Court never ruled on it. So, I guess we might wait to see, what they say. If she were to sue us, right, if Pam Bondi were to sue Washington State, there are two basic legal doctrines that are kind of at tension here based on what I've learned from reading and talking to experts like Evans. So on the one hand, the federal government has what experts call supremacy. Federal immigration law supersedes state laws, to super simplify it. You can't have states all just willy-nilly creating their own immigration laws. That would be a mess. So the feds have that role. But the feds aren't allowed to what they call commandeer state resources like police to enforce federal priorities. And that's the argument from Democrats, right? It's like our police should focus on enforcing our local laws. And I think about, the sponsor of the Keep Washington Working Act, who was at the press conference too. This is Mercer Island Democrat Lisa Wellman. She had a very straightforward message for the feds.
Do your damn job and leave us the hell alone. Thank you.
Pretty straightforward. So you also, Scott, talked to our Attorney General, Nick Brown, this week. So how's he thinking about Pam Bondi's letter and what Washington is doing in response?
He was a little cooler about it it wasn't addressed to him, right? But basically he said, I have to take it seriously because it's the top law enforcement officer in the U.S., but this letter's a lot of bluster and vague threats and not a lot of case law. The Keep Washington Working Act was designed with federal supremacy in mind. I wrote in my story that tensions are escalating. I do think that's true. And it is sobering to hear, right, quasi-authoritarian or, the governor saying, dragging us toward authoritarianism. Nick Brown said something like that, too.
I mean, the governor is basically saying I may be thrown in jail for this. And we've already heard our own Seattle police chief here in town say, I'm ready to be thrown in jail for this.
Yes. And I don't want to downplay any anxiety. But, Ferguson got this letter along with 6 other governors and a lot of mayors. It has a lot of threats. Other Trump diehards here are being threatening, right? Like Pierce County Sheriff Keith Swank. He posted about this letter on X. I'm looking forward to warrants being issued. I'm going to have to dust off and oil up my cuffs.
Oh, oil them up. Okay.
I like what?
They're rusty. I guess they're rusty
creaky.
And you oil them.
Yeah. Okay.
Like the Tin Man.
But yeah, again, like the feds have shown their willingness to trample over local jurisdictions, like in D.C., with pretty thin justifications. But they can't do that in all the places where they sent letters, I think. So the question is, who do they target next?
Have you been doing the ranking in your head, Scott, of like the cities that the Trump administration is more likely to go after before Seattle? I feel like we're not the biggest. Yeah. We're not the most prominent. Like they're going to go after more California places. They'll go after Baltimore.
Yeah, maybe Chicago.
Yeah, different blue-led cities. And the fact that we're here where you're saying, okay, they've got other priorities, so it's probably going to be a few months before National Guard troops are like in the streets of Seattle. That is remarkable, to say the least. That's where we're at. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, immigration, it's not just an abstract issue playing out in courtrooms and on letterhead. Trump's deportation campaign has had real impacts in Washington. We're going to talk to somebody who can give us a better picture of what they are after this. Back with Sound Politics now. And this whole back and forth between Washington and the Justice Department, State Representative Julio Cortez has had a front row seat to that. He was at Governor Ferguson's press conference this week, but he also represents Everett, Marysville, and the Tulalip Reservation in the state legislature and is the vice chair of the House Democratic Latino Caucus. Representative Cortez joins us now. Welcome. It's really good to meet you for the first time. I know you've talked to Scott before. Good to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I look forward to chatting. I mean, being a state rep in the 38th LD, Everett, Marysville, Tulalip has given me a great experience, but I grew up in Eastern Washington, so I have a good sense of kind of the entire state and what we've been seeing down there.
Democrats have argued that the Keep Washington Working Act lets local law enforcement focus on local issues. On the other hand, Republicans have said, and for example, the chairman of the state GOP said in an email this week, that that's a false premise, that he believes the governor is actively keeping immigration officials from accessing jails and prisons. The Keep Washington Working Act does generally limit that access, except in a few cases. For example, DOC can alert ICE when somebody is getting out of prison, and Ferguson has refused to close that loophole. I mean, what is your response to Republican arguments that basically this is impeding important law enforcement activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Keep Washington Working Act is working as intended. I think that, first, the overwhelming majority of immigrants abide by the law. Washington state does not protect criminals. When anyone, regardless of their immigration status, commits a crime, they face consequences and are held accountable. That's what the Keep Washington Working Act is doing. And, additionally, I think that because of this law and that separation between state and federal forces doing their work, I think our community feels safer when interacting with our law enforcement. And I think that is something that's going to improve public safety overall and build community trust with our law enforcement. And I think that's really, really important, especially nowadays.
We know that obviously Trump is deporting more folks and detaining more folks who have not committed any crimes other than, being in the country without federal authorization. But I do, Republicans often talk about the ones, who do have criminal records, right? And this came up at the press conference you were at. And I wanted to ask you about this because there was a right-wing commentator, Brandy Cruz, who asked the governor about a case where an undocumented immigrant was found guilty of vehicular manslaughter after he hit a Washington State patrol officer and killed him in a car. Ferguson, said if anyone breaks the law, kind of like what you just said, they will be prosecuted. It doesn't matter whether they're an undocumented immigrant or not. Cruz's question, though, she tried to ask it again. Ferguson didn't answer. I think it's not so much, the hypothetical of she was talking about he had previous run-ins with law enforcement. And if he had been deported during those run-ins with local law enforcement, he wouldn't have, killed the trooper. I'm not really interested in hypotheticals so much, but it's this underlying idea that someone who's undocumented commits a crime in Washington, we should work with the feds to deport them. How do you respond to that argument? Because I feel like it comes up a lot.
Well, I feel like that was an interesting point, but I think that whether they're an immigrant to this country or not, our laws should be protecting from that happening again, right? When somebody has their fourth or fifth DUI and is continued to be let out, then there has to be consequences for that. But that's our law, our state law, and so maybe we need to look at our state law and stop just kind of pointing the finger at whether they're immigrants or their color of their skin, and really focus on the laws that were broken and why they weren't held accountable the third or fourth time. I think that they're using immigrants as scapegoats for these specific things, and that just is wrong. It can't happen again. The overwhelming majority of our immigrants abide by the law. If we maybe take a step back and look at how many DUIs accidents are perpetrated nationwide, I can guarantee you that a very small percentage of those are immigrants, right? But that's what they're pointing the finger at, and it's wrong.
I want to turn to a more personal question, Representative, because the way ICE and the feds have been going about taking people, we've seen the videos out of Washington, D.C. and L.A. and different parts of the country. These are people who show up. We assume they're ICE, but we don't always know. They wear masks. They don't identify themselves. In some cases, they have fired guns. I mean, that happened to a family in San Bernardino. We learned today from a UW study that 14 people with ties to Washington have been sent to notorious prisons in El Salvador and Guantanamo Bay. And I think it's fair to say that this threat has an effect personally on people in the community. Can you talk to me about what you're seeing on the ground amid this atmosphere?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of fear for sure, right? And the fear comes from that not knowing. I think that if just the fact that these ICE agents aren't identifiable, they're not identifying themselves, is very, very scary, right? Because anybody can go out and buy a mask, and folks can have guns, and they can buy all that tactical gear online, right? And so how do we know that these are individuals that are there to serve a federal purpose and not just individuals who are out here causing chaos and fear? And so it's definitely creating a lot of fear, and it's impacting not only our communities feeling safe, but also our local economics, right? The folks that are not able to go to work because of fear that they're going to be picked up by ICE for no reason, the folks that aren't going to shop at grocery stores, at local food vendors, that impacts our local economies, and they're not going to work, right? Local businesses depend on these workers. The Keep Washington Working Act helps prevent labor shortages and keeps critical industries, like agriculture, for example. We've all seen the impacts on our agriculture industry when workers don't show up. It has a huge impact on our economy, and I don't think that that's being realized as much from our federal partners.
I know we talk a lot about work, and obviously it is important. I think obviously play is very important too. Celebration is very important too. And we've seen the impacts hit, even here locally, hit local celebrations, right? Gatherings. The Duwamish River Festival in Seattle's South Park neighborhood was canceled this summer. That's a majority Latino neighborhood in Seattle. Because of fears of deportation actions, they canceled that festival. There was the Thing Festival's Latin Day in Carnation that got canceled. And, reading comments online on local, like Reddit pages and things like that, Facebook, people say it feels like they're stealing our joy and literally shutting down our celebrations. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think we need our partners, right? We need not just the immigrant communities, but our communities as a whole to be there and show up for each other right now. I think now more than ever, Washington State at least has to come together and celebrate each other and make each other feel safe. It's absolutely it's got an impact to our culture, and these are not just black and brown immigrants. It's immigrants from all races and colors that are not feeling safe here anymore, right? Whether you're from the Latin American community or Eastern European community or the Asian community, those fears are very, very real, and it's causing us to not have those celebrations anymore. But we need our partners to come together and celebrate for us when we can't do that. I think it's going to continue to be incredibly important for us to show up for each other right now.
Has this change in the way that the White House and the Trump administration is going about immigration enforcement affected you personally, Representative, or your family?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. My family travels to Mexico to visit family all the time, once a year at least. And I have family from Mexico that'll come up just to visit us and tour around. And that's not happening this year. It's not going to happen probably for the next couple of years just because we are a little fearful of what may happen at the border. I myself, travel for work. And I do have a trip to DC coming up, and it's something that I'm very nervous about. I'm a naturalized citizen, but I'm going to be carrying my passport everywhere I go. I used to feel safe walking at night in DC and going to explore before, and now that this is happening in DC, that safety is just not there for me anymore. So I'll probably be sticking closer to the hotel.
Representative Julio Cortez represents Washington's 38th Legislative District and is the vice chair of the House Democratic Latino Caucus. Is there anything else you want to add, Representative, before we go?
Well, I think that, we got to keep in mind that, immigrants here in Washington State, they pay state and federal taxes and in many cases contribute to Social Security, a system that they are never going to benefit from. And so we need to remember that they are contributing members to our community and important members of our community. And additionally, one more thing I just wanted to make sure that we're all aware of is programs supported by these funds that are being threatened help all Washingtonians. Cutting them would have very harmful impact on our public safety, our public health, and our economy, and not only in immigrant communities. It's going to be a huge negative impact on all of us. So let's keep that in mind.
Thanks, Representative.
Thank you.
So we heard from Representative Cortez that, these things have really personal impact, and he's changing vacation plans over this and, concerned about, trips to our nation's capital, which, for somebody who's a naturalized citizen is thinking about carrying his passport around, which I know I've spoken to a lot of folks who are in that zone as well. I don't know, Scott, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, it is so hard to wake up sort of every day and wonder how much should I be anxious about this, right? Talking to Nick Brown, hearing from the governor, they kind of wrestle with how often do I bring out the A word, right? The authoritarian word, and kind of wondering, are we, overblowing the danger? But I mean, you're right. I keep going back to what you were talking about, the list. Right? Where are we on the list? And that's, even if maybe last year I would have said Seattle is pretty high on the list of places where the National Guard could get deployed, like DC and LA. Now I think we're further down, right? I feel like he's talking more about Chicago. We have not been as high profile, and
California. And what are the common elements between Chicago and cities in California? They both have governors who are planning to likely run for president in 2028. Luckily, for Washington State, I think Bob Ferguson's political aspirations are not including that particular run. When you have a governor out there who's taking punches and kind of being the lightning rod for the
Yeah.
opposition to the Trump administration, it seems like there's also a lot of attention on those cities.
Well, and that's what's so hard about this thing, because it's like we may be on that list, especially if there were loud protests here or things like that. But at the same time, like Governor Ferguson is clearly unpopular here, and he is, not to be really cynical, but it does seem clear that he is trying to focus on this stuff. At the same time he's doing this press conference, I'm asking him about how much Democrats reduced Medicaid, and he's not, he declined to comment on these, numbers that I recently got that show that the reductions in Medicaid could be like, $750 million, and we're talking Democrats' reductions.
Yeah, cuts that the legislature passed that he
passed.
signed that have nothing to do with what's coming down the road from the big, beautiful bill. Just really quick before we go, the other striking piece of news that we got this week was that Pew Research says that the number of immigrants in the United States declined by nearly 1.5 million in between January and June of this year. That's the first time in decades that has happened. So if you just look at those demographic numbers, like the policy, whether or not they can meet their really high quotas day to day for the number of people being deported, people are choosing to leave. People are choosing to not come here. And the question is, what does that do to America going forward?
That's right. And these changes, these are real changes, generational changes, I think. That was what struck me this morning when I read that number.
We're ending on kind of a bummer note, so here's a way to turn it around, Scott.
Okay.
We have some donors to shout out to Sound Politics.
Yay.
Jackson and Molly, thank you so much for your gift to help keep Sound Politics strong. We rely on folks like you who value this local podcast because, we need to be able to show that people are listening and that people support it, particularly right now. And I'm just so grateful. Jackson and Molly, thank you.
That's a way better note to end our show on.
There you
go. That is it for Sound Politics today. Our show is produced by Hans Anderson. Our editor is Kat Smith. I'm KUOW Politics reporter Scott Greenstone.
And I'm Libby Denkmann. Thank you so much to Jackson and Molly and everybody who gives to Sound Politics. You can do so at KUOW.org/politics.
See you next week.